All right, this is concept 3 notes in our pathogens mini unit, and we are going to talk about defense. So, just before we jump in, I'm going to just be doing an overview of defense and of the immune system. It is a very complex body system, so there's so much more I could go into, and there are some great video links I'm including in the notes section of that first slide if you want to go into more detail. So, just to begin with an overview, one key component of maintaining homeostasis is protection against disease. And all organisms have some sort of disease fighting mechanisms, but vertebrates specifically have immune systems. So, what is the immune system considered? It is a network of organs that work together to recognize, fight, and defend against foreign substances, all the way down to at a cellular level. And the immune system to me is the most fascinating example of homeostatic regulation in our bodies because it goes all the way from the full system level to that inner cellular level. And it's incredibly unique compared to some of the other body systems because it utilizes organs and tissues that are in nearly every other body system. So it's a highly collaborative organ system. But because of that, it makes it a bit more complex. So a couple of terms that are critical for us to define before we jump in. One is pathogens, so the name of this unit. We've mentioned this before, but these are organisms like bacteria or fungi, but they can also be viruses. Remember, viruses are not organisms because they're not living. And they cause disease. That's what pathogens are. Antigens are foreign substances that act as signaling molecules to induce an immune response in the body. So they are a part of the pathogen that your body is going to learn to recognize. And that immune response that they can induce could be something like to produce antibodies. Antibodies are proteins used by your immune system to neutralize pathogens. And antigens don't always have to be bad, and they don't always have to be associated with pathogens and things that cause disease. So, for example, blood type. Your red blood cells have proteins on their plasma membranes that are antigens, and your body can only tolerate blood cells that have the same antigens on them as your own blood cells. So, for example, if you have type A blood, if that's your blood type, that means you have A antigens on your red blood cells. So you can only take in type A blood because your body can recognize and receive those type A antigens. If you were to try to take in type B blood in a blood transfusion, those type B antigens on those type B red blood cells, your body would reject those because your body has developed antibodies that are anti those B antigens, since they're considered to be foreign substances to your body if you're type A. People with type B blood like me, we have both A and B antigens present, which is what makes it possible for us to have blood transfusions of either type A or type B. Type O blood has no antigens on it, which is why people of any blood type are able to accept it. So those are some critical vocab words. One last thing to mention before we move on into more detail is the goal. The goal of your immune system is to detect and then deflect pathogens. But if the deflection or the detection doesn't work, your body will then try to destroy those pathogens. White blood cells, which are also known as lymphocytes, are the key players in this. They produce antibodies. They engulf invading substances. They tag pathogens for killing and removal. And they create a memory inside of you so that you can fight off from future attacks. This picture is fascinating to me. It is digitally colored. So the yellow is showing staph bacteria, and the blue are actually white blood cells that are about to destroy those staph bacteria, which is a picture courtesy of the CDC, which is pretty cool. So, the eventual hope of your immune system is to get you to the point of immunity. So, when you are at the point where you've developed enough defenses against a pathogen that you can successfully and avoid an invasion from it. So, we have two types of defenses: innate immunity and adaptive immunity. So, in your notes, I'm going to do a brief overview of both and give you a list of characteristics about each. And then I'm going to go back and hit some highlights under each as well. So, first, innate immunity. This is your non-specific defenses. All plants and animals have these non-specific innate defenses in them. These are typically your first and second lines of defense against invasion, and they have a rapid response time. They're going to respond to invasion within 0 to 96 hours. Mechanisms for innate immunity. How do we do this? How do we accomplish this? Well, physical barriers like your skin, like mucus, and plants, like that cuticle coat that they have. We also utilize antimicrobial proteins like lysozymes and defensins. We use signaling proteins like interferons. Inflammation is a mechanism of innate immunity. Phagocytosis, however you want to pronounce it. And then, of course, white blood cells are so important in our immune system, like your natural killer cells, which we'll talk more about. This is different from adaptive immunity. So everyone is born with innate immunity, but adaptive is something that develops over time. It is specific. It has learned how to respond to certain pathogens. So it's a learned immunity. It's acquired, if you will. It remembers. It has a memory for future invasions. Only vertebrates have this adaptive immunity. It's specifically using white blood cells called B cells and T cells. And it has a greater response time, usually over 96 hours. So it is slower to develop, but it is also a longer lasting protection and defense. It's a very systemic process. So there are procedures that your body's going through to protect you. Key mechanisms are humoral immunity, which utilize B cells and antibodies, and then cellular immunity or cellular mediated response, which utilize T cells specifically. So we're going to go back and hit some highlights about each of these. So first, innate immunity. Your first line of defense for innate immunity is external. We're talking your skin. That is a huge defense. Your skin is constantly coming into contact with pathogens, and it's protecting you from them. Now, if you have a cut or some sort of opening in your skin, that's going to break that protection and allow some of those pathogens in. So that's a problem, but your skin really does protect you a ton. Another big form of protection is mucus and mucous membranes. Every opening in your skin, such as in your mouth or in your nose, these have these mucous membranes in the lining, and these protect against respiratory, digestive, urinary, and reproductive infections in those tracts. Your second line of defense that still falls under innate immunity is internal, and these are responses such as fever. When your body has a fever, that's increasing the metabolism of those cells so that hopefully they can heal faster from invasion. There are chemical signals. We talked about signaling in our homeostasis mini unit that are sent off to cause different things to happen in the body. Inflammation is one of those responses from those chemical signals. This is almost acting like an internal fire alarm that's telling your body that there is an invasion and we need to do something about it. And then, of course, we have your defensive cells or those white blood cells. And I'm going to talk about two key white blood cells on the next two slides. So first, phagocytes. These are defensive cells, white blood cells, that eat pathogens in order to get rid of them. So an example of phagocytes, there are a bunch of different types, but one is neutrophils. These are the most abundant white blood cell. And when you have a cut or some sort of injury in that regard and it starts to pus, that pus is a clump of neutrophils, of those white blood cells that have gone and they have essentially eaten the bacteria or what other pathogen has been there that has caused the infection in order to get rid of them. So pus is actually a good sign showing that your body is working and it's fighting. We also have another defensive cell, another white blood cell called macrophages. And these use cytoplasmic extensions, which you can kind of see in this clip art diagram, that kind of reel in and then eat the bad stuff that infects you. And that eating, I put in quotations because it's not eating how we eat, but it's a similar process called phagocytosis. It's the ingestion of pathogens in order to destroy them. And this picture is pretty cool. This is a microscopic picture, and it's showing in the microscope a mesothelial cell in a mouse actually ingesting a bacterium. So here's the bacterium right here. This is the cell membrane. It's taking in that bacterium in order to digest it through phagocytosis and get rid of it. Another critical defensive white blood cell in your body are your natural killer cells, or also known as your NK cells. These defensive cells kill your own cells by triggering them to do apoptosis, or programmed cell death, if they recognize that those cells are infected. So this is when your body recognizes cancer cells, it recognizes tumors forming, or it recognizes virus-infected cells. It's going to try to trigger them with NK cells to do apoptosis. And it does this by using a protein called perforin to create pores in the cell membrane of whatever cell's infected. And then through those pores, the NK cells can inject enzymes that will stimulate the cell to do apoptosis and die, which is pretty cool. And this is a 3D illustration right here showing these lymphocytes, these white blood cells, these NK cells. That's what we have on top here, attacking some cancer cells in order to get rid of them, which is pretty cool. All right, so that is a brief overview of innate immunity. Now let's talk about that adaptive immunity that you acquire throughout your life. Babies are not born with adaptive immunity. It has to develop, and that takes time. But babies that are breastfed are able to receive antibodies from their mother's breast milk. But they're still going to have to develop their own immune system, adaptive immune system, eventually once they're not using breast milk. So that's important. So in order for adaptive immunity to work, an organism must be introduced to a specific pathogen and then be able to recognize it as a threat before it can know how to handle it and process it for future invasions. But once it's able to do that, it can then remember that specific pathogen and then achieve immunity from it, hopefully over time. So let's talk about humoral immunity first. Humoral immunity can happen naturally, like when you're exposed to the flu at school from a classmate, but it can also happen artificially when we expose you to the flu, say, in a flu shot. So what is it? It is a way of causing your body to dispatch antibodies, which are proteins. So the key player here are your B lymphocytes, or your B cells. These are white blood cells, WBC, that are made and mature in your bone marrow. And what they do is they distinguish between good and bad cells in your body. Some of these B cells become effector cells, and they are going to fight off infection. These effector cells actually have tons of rough endoplasmic reticulum, and that allows them to mass produce these antibodies, because antibodies are proteins. Rough ER are ribosomes, and ribosomes make proteins. Remember that from our cells unit. And because of this, they're able to make like 2,000 antibodies per second, which is crazy. So these effector cells are effective. Some B cells, though, are memory cells. And so their purpose is helping the body remember what to do so that if they're exposed to something like the flu again, they could fight this in the future. Now, this is different from cellular immunity, which is also known as cell-mediated response or cellular immune response. This is when that invasion, that infection has made it through the cell membrane. So it's cellular defenses when pathogens have made their way into the cell through the cell membrane. So what do? We utilize T lymphocytes, or T cells. These are white blood cells that mature in your thymus, and they're like your special forces unit that we dispatch in your cells. They're going to cause inflammation, activate those macrophages we talked about, and they're going to regulate your immune response. And there are several types of T cells, but the two main types to know of are your helper T cells, which activate cells that, hey, there's a problem here, and they get your killer T cells going. That's the other key type, your killer T cells. These are the ones that are actually going and killing cells that are going bad or that have been invaded with an infection. So here we have just like a clip art graphic of a T cell. Here's more of like a 3D graphic illustration of what one looks like, but you can see kind of these protrusions on them. Okay, take a deep breath. That is a very quick overview of the immune system. But we can't talk about defense without talking about prevention mechanisms and, of course, treatment. So, what are we doing on an organismal level to prevent or treat disease? Well, one is antibiotics. These are used to treat bacterial illnesses. So antibiotics are only used for bacterial illnesses. They target specific bacterial structures and kill them. Originally, the very first antibiotic, was made from a fungus called penicillin, which is a mold, but now most are artificial. And our major issue with antibiotics is they are overused and misused all the time. And so many people and organisms have developed antibiotic resistance. So they're not as effective as they should be. And we're going to have an activity where we're going to learn a bit more about this because this is really fascinating and it's a really great example of evolution in our lifetime that we can investigate and study. So that's just a brief overview. Another kind of treatment is antivirals. These are used to treat viral illnesses. They don't kill a virus because the virus isn't really living, but they can shorten the symptoms and the length of those symptoms in your body. Typically, you're only going to get an antiviral medication if you have life-threatening symptoms. If you get something like the common cold, which is caused by a virus, there's not really much the doctor is going to do to you or do for you except for prescribe you something like NyQuil or DayQuil just to help with your symptoms. But those aren't going to actually get rid of the virus. You just kind of have to ride it out. Okay, let's talk prevention. The number one way we can prevent against disease is with vaccination. Vaccines are substances used to stimulate your immune system to guard against attack. We can use them to prevent viral diseases and bacterial. So all these different diseases we studied in our most recent research project after Concept 2 notes. What vaccines do is they expose your immune system to antigens, those foreign substances, before infection, so your immune system knows how to respond. So essentially, we're tricking your immune system to make antibodies that your body will remember how to make later if the real thing invades in order to decrease your response time to that disease. Because remember, adaptive immunity, that's like an over 96-hour response time. So vaccines help us decrease that response time. They are usually made from a weakened virus, an inactivated virus, or simply just part of a virus or bacteria. And again, they're stimulating your immune system to react, preparing your body for future invasions. And the most important thing, I think, is herd immunity. That is how vaccines work best. It's this idea that people live in close communities with each other. And if we're all getting vaccinated, that's preventing the vaccine from being able to spread. We have immunity as a herd because we're all preventing these microbes from spreading between us. And I could try to explain this better, but truly there is a fantastic illustration and an explanation of this in a 5-minute video clip in the notes section of these slides that you need to watch because he does such a good job explaining with a visual diagram of why herd immunity works and why it's so important. And this is something we're going to talk about in our vaccine debate because there are a lot of people, I shouldn't say a lot, there's kind of always a trend in society for certain people to be anti-vaccination, which, if enough people got on board with that, would cause a serious problem for everyone else because it would decrease our herd immunity. So that's something we're going to investigate as a class. But I digress. Got to move forward. So last thing I want to talk about, your immune system is not perfect. No system in your body is. So there are a couple ways that your immune system can fail, or a better way to put it is just not function as it should. So one of those ways is when we get autoimmune disorders such as AIDS. So some viral diseases like AIDS, which is caused by HIV, which is a virus, they damage your immune system. And this causes your body to be unable to deal with infectious agents and cancer cells. So it's basically a disorder or a disease that's making your immune system function less or worse than it should be, or inefficiently. Another example of a failure of your immune system is an allergic reaction. This is when your body's immune system is overreacting to a usually harmless environmental substance. And it's a continued overreaction, which can result in hypersensitivity to certain substances, such as tree nuts or pollen, a variety of different things. And then lastly, you're kind of along the same grain as allergic reactions, but you can have an overactive immune system that actually attacks itself. So some diseases cause your body, they're working so hard to fight against disease that they don't recognize self and they actually attack yourself. Examples are lupus, rheumatoid arthritis, MS, which is multiple sclerosis. So these are all examples of just ways that your body's immune system is going to fail, to do what it's designed to do. And that was me attempting to do a brief overview of the immune system and how we defend against pathogens.